Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and continuing our discussions about the state of the city, and to help us understand it better, this evening's guest is the president of the City Council, Julie Flowers. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks, George. Thanks for having me back. It's always good to be here with you.
So the state of the city is getting to be a little complicated lately. There was a big to-do about the Bass River overlay, and that's sort of back on the back burner again.
Yep.
And then there is the dust-up over the bridges being out. And one of the things that has discouraged me is I've talked to several of the political and connected people, and being a not retired from I was in the Army.
Sure.
I was a combat engineer. And one of the things I learned how to do is put up a Bailey Bridge. And to me, that's a simple solution. And they used it on I-95 a couple of years ago. And the story comes back that, well, we couldn't put a Bailey Bridge in because really it's not that urgent a problem. And as I've written to a couple of people that I would like to sell tickets to the day that some politically correct individual stands up in Ailes Ryleside School in a town meeting says, oh, it wasn't urgent. Then the fun will begin. So there's all these things going on. So I guess one of the issues is, how do you make something happen? I mean, you recognize what all the problems are. You get told about them. You don't have to wait till you see me to find out. Yeah.
No, that's a great question. And, you said the state of the city is getting a little complicated. And I think you're right. We all feel that. I think this coming out of COVID, this past year and a half, has felt like a lot of issues, perhaps things that, the city couldn't deal with or didn't deal with, like the Bass River rezoning during the pandemic because we were all in this public health emergency. These things have all kind of risen to the forefront, and it does create this feeling that, wow, our city is really busy with lots of things going on, many of them exciting, and some of them really urgent and frustrating for residents. And the bridge, both bridges actually, as you say, that's a really good example of one that is urgent and frustrating for residents. And to your point, taking longer than I think any of us would have liked. So one of the ways I think with the bridges that we've really sought to try to ease some of that pain for residents is sort of this dual effort of, as a city, really working with our state level and even federal level legislators, because as you know, some of what's going on here is about permitting processes to get these bridges replaced, and some of those timelines by statute are just too long for the situation that we're in. And so working with some of those higher levels of government to really get those legislators in our neighborhoods, seeing what's going on and asking for where they can help to expedite the process has been a piece of it. And another piece of it, I would say, and I just want to say, especially my colleague, Councilor Rotundo, Ward 1 Councilor Todd Rotundo, has really been just a great leader on this front, which is understanding what our residents, particularly our Ryle side, but also our Ward 2 Goat Hill residents are impacted by this, where they're feeling the most pain points around traffic, these detours, and really trying to take whatever steps we can to mitigate that. So one example of that is that Councilor Rotundo, put forward and the council supported a temporary ordinance change that changes Kernwood Heights to a one-way during certain times. And that's just, one small example of ways that we can try to listen to our residents and at least alleviate some of the pain that's happening with this. We also added a crosswalk over to Livingston Park because there was more traffic, coming in that area. So those things don't fix the bridge immediately, but they do strive to improve the quality of life for our residents.
Well, that gets to be the continual problem that small groups are inflicted with these various problems, and they're not significant enough in the eyes of the people that make things happen to really fix them. And the other one got into this with Ward 5, Kathleen the other day, Dunham Road.
Yes.
It's a tremendous opportunity for the city to develop Dunham Ridge. Great tax benefits, great working opportunities for the city, and yet it goes back to Scanlon when they were talking about let's put a bridge across 128. And, to my way of thinking is, well, one of the quickest solutions would be to extend Dunham Road all the way out to Essex Street, get another entrance, so you're not going through a neighborhood to get to the other Cummings Center. And, well, can't do that because of, again, permitting. So I guess somewhere along the line, somebody's got to bite the bullet and say, the flounder that are going to be breeding up the Bass River, or the walkability of around the ponds, it's nice to have it, but in the meantime, we got to make some accommodations. And some of these permitting processes, I think, should be reconsidered to say, well, it's a temporary situation, and really make it temporary, because I think that's what a lot of them are concerned about, that if they give up a little bit now, they'll never get it back.
Well, and one good thing is where we have now come to with the state, because you're working on both the Hall Whitaker Bridge and the Kernwood Bridge, as you know, they're state bridges, and one problem is that in the state there are so many bridges in disrepair, and that's something that our state needs to really grapple with for safety and for our infrastructure. But with both of these bridges, we have come to the point now that there's commitment to build temporary bridges alongside both of the current bridges, get those open and passable, and then build the permanent fixed bridge next to it, and then remove the temporary. And I think initially that was sort of hard to come to with the state, but having a temporary bridge in place, that's your point being, why can't we put up something that makes this passable?
Yeah.
And that's really got to be a priority, because right now for our residents, people are they're making accommodations, they're getting around, but it certainly has made their quality of life and their ability to move freely around in and out of Ryleside particularly just incredibly difficult, and does increase traffic in and around Ayers School as well, which is a concern that I know Councilor Rotundo's been keeping a close eye on. Our Beverly Police Department's been keeping a close eye on, but keeping our residents and especially our kids going to and from school safe is a high priority. And getting these temporary bridges in so that people can move freely is a high priority as well.
Well, I hate to keep harping on it. It's nothing but problems, because, but basically, that's what the city council is all about, and what the mayor is all about, is fixing problems, because otherwise the city would run by itself.
True.
And the Dunham Road area is a concern. Not sure how much of the concern that's being raised by Danvers over the airport gets reflected in the city council, but that's another thing that keeps showing up here and there, that it's too noisy, too busy. But yet, at the other hand, you look at the city and say, well, what's good about the city? We have our own airport.
Sure.
And the more it's used, the better off I think we are. And I remember going back years ago, I was living in Chicago, and people were complaining about Midway, same thing. And they shut Midway down, and they still complain, but anyway, because they moved out to O'Hare. So there's always going to be that concern. And how do you deal with it, I guess, can you invite somebody to a committee meeting and say, okay, tell me what your problem is, tell me what the solution is, and try to work it out, but don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right to say the city council and the mayor are partially in the business of problem solving and hearing from residents when problems arise. We're obviously, I'm a resident of Beverly, we're residents of Beverly, so we see some of those things and experience them ourselves, but one of the most important things I always say is also hearing from residents about what is happening in their neighborhood, on their street. Your point about Dunham Road's a really good example, because it's those residents have really kept our eye on that fact that this road is becoming too busy for this neighborhood. What's growing in that area needs to be serviceable by cars in a different way, because it's sort of outpaced the road in that residential area. But hearing from people about all kinds of things that they see, feel, and experience in their city. And, you asked what can be done. I always think a first step really is inviting people to share more with me or with us, whether that means sitting down over coffee, which I frequently do. I love to, if someone sends me an email, I like to be able to follow up in some way to be able to talk more, or coming to public meetings. And that's something, the city council in a sort of organized governmental fashion, that's sort of a role that the city council also plays, is giving that public space, public forum for people to come and share with us about what's happening in their view and in their lives in the city. And that can happen in the context of public meetings. That's kind of the most official way, when there's public comment and people come on a specific issue. And one example, I think, from this past term of a really big public hearing where I think we really worked hard to create that forum and to work hard for our residents, had to do with National Grid putting in this regional reliability cable, high transmission cable line that's going under many of our city streets, and the city council has to grant what's called a grant of location. And the state statutes don't give cities and towns a lot of authority over denying those once the state has cited them. But what we could do was really have a public meeting, have a public hearing that went long enough, in our view, to continue to hear from residents, and then reflect back what we heard and put conditions on this grant of location to try to best protect our residents as this project goes forward. So people coming to a public meeting and speaking in a formal way in a public hearing is one way that we can hear from them and then best represent them. But as you know, George, because I know you've done it, but there's also those 3 citizen speaker spots at every regular city council meeting. And I know not everybody in Beverly is aware of those, so I like to mention it because those are just 3 spots that any resident can come and talk to the council about what's on their mind or what's happening. And every speaker gets up to 5 minutes. And all they have to do is contact the city clerk by 9:30 the morning of the meeting, say they'd like to be in the citizen speaker spot. I know those can feel funny to people because it's not a back and forth. It's not a dialogue with the council. But I do know, I feel strongly, and I know my colleagues do too, that when residents come and address us and raise things there, it really does spark further conversation or lets us know things that we can begin to put our attention to if we haven't already to tackle for them.
Well, you're talking about the challenge with National Grid and the power line. You got a replay of that with the gas line going out Hale Street.
Yes.
And I mentioned before on a previous show, was quite concerned with was it for a city councilor making the comment, well, we ought to vote no just to make a point. And you raised an interesting question about that. When we, the city, put all these restrictions on it, what's the implications of that? To my way of thinking is being a public utility, National Grid, either electric or gas, they are guaranteed that they're going to get all their expenses back. So if we raise the expenses on them by some cute little extra thing we want, it's going to show up in my gas bill or my electric bill. And I get somewhat concerned that this kind of thinking doesn't get recognized, that there's no free lunch.
Sure. And, to your point, National Grid certainly is going to want to recoup their cost.
Yeah.
The kinds of conditions with the KV transmission line that we were thinking about really, I think, are things that largely, in my view, shouldn't raise their costs too much, and really are the things that we'd hope National Grid would be thinking about anyway for residents. Like, if they're going to come work right in front of your driveway, which this particular transmission line, the electric one, which is separate from the gas line, but you're right, that's another one that's been a conversation, is just going to run really close to some residents' homes. It actually already is up in Goat Hill. Folks on Wellman and Weber are already experiencing the start of this project. Yeah. And so asking for better communication. One thing that was happening was National Grid just wasn't communicating to residents along the project what would be happening. And so making sure that if they're going to be right in front of your driveway and you won't be able to get your car in and out after 8 a.m., making sure that someone knocks on your door and make sure that that's clear to you. So asking for that kind of level of communication with residents, having somebody, and they do have project and site managers, but having a sort of a point phone number where if residents are having an emergency right in the moment. And an example of that is that on Wellman there was a broken pipe that occurred as this project was beginning, and there was water and other materials running into someone's basement, and so that's an emergent moment, and that resident really needed somebody to be able to call, and that also was a moment that revealed to us that we, with National Grid, needed to improve how residents knew who to contact in that level of emergency. And so it's those kind of conditions that I think, at least in that case, we were talking about. So, that reduce the public's, how much they feel the impact of the project, not necessarily asking that National Grid tweak how they were going to do the project. Although in some cases there were things that we asked for, like making available to each resident an interior and exterior survey of their foundation, for example, before the project began. And that was one of the examples of something that was designed to help protect residents if they want to take advantage of it, in the case that something were to happen to their home during the construction.
So it gets down to the issue that, like you mentioned, with this new situations with the broken pipe, you can't think of all of these things in advance. You'd like to believe that, oh yeah, we know exactly how to do this, and I get a weekly email from National Grid saying what's happening on Wellman Street or where they are now, putting in manholes and all this stuff. So there is a lot of stuff being done to mitigate the impact on these projects. And I can remember when they went through my neighborhood and changed the gas line, there were times when, like you said, they knocked on the door and said, you either get your car out of the driveway now or leave it there for the rest of the day. So, or they warned me, you can't park in front, you got to park on the side. So,
just having that level of communication for residents so that, you don't come out and find yourself with your car stuck and you're trying to get to the doctor or something.
So that's helpful. But I think the more we get into some of these issues, there needs to be, I think, a hell of a lot better communication. And I'm not sure how we make that happen at the city level. And again, a lot of these problems really are instigated at the state level or the national level. And how do you get somebody to speak up for you at that level? Not sure what the connection is between the city and, say, the senator from our district, Senator Lovely, or Jerry Paracella, our local rep.
Yeah, I think you're making a great point that a lot of times what cities and towns deal with are issues that are sort of occurring in a systematic way at a higher level of government. And our job is on the ground for the people who live in this community. How do we try to mitigate problems or advocate at the state level for funding? Sometimes that's a big part of it, is funding that cities and towns need. So I think, you mentioned Senator Lovely and Representative Paracella. That's a big piece of it, is trying to really make sure that our communication and advocacy on behalf of our residents, as a city, as city leaders, to Senator Lovely and her team, to Representative Paracella and his team, has to be really strong. And I'll say one thing that I think we're fortunate in is that both Representative Paracella and Senator Lovely are quite responsive. They'll attend events, they'll come to learn about things happening in our neighborhoods, and that's really, I think, a way that we can then as a city reflect to them what's happening on the ground in a specific neighborhood or a specific area. And one example of that working well, although I would love to have seen progress quicker on the ground, we're getting there, is in the Jordan Street neighborhood, which is the neighborhood behind Dairy Queen, sort of down towards the high school, the back of the high school. There's been quite a bit of flooding at certain points when we've gotten some bigger storms, and part of that has to do with drainage, and part of it has to do with the creek that runs behind the neighborhood. And so having the chance to bring Senator Lovely, Representative Paracella out to the neighborhood to hear from neighbors and hear what was going on with them resulted in us as a city getting a $200,000 earmark that Representative Paracella helped to advocate for, that's specifically to go for infrastructure work in the Jordan Street neighborhood. And so that will be happening. Residents will see that change coming. Basically, we're going to add another storm drain, which it needs, just to get water that comes down off of Snell, and it runs down onto sort of this low-level point on Jordan Street. Adding some more infrastructure will help alleviate some of the pressure on that. And that's an example of where the city, beginning with its residents, I think that's always the important thing, is to recognize the power of residents' voices. Residents letting then Ward 3 Councilor Stacey Ames know what was happening in their lives. And now Ward 3 Councilor Steve Crowley has been continuing that work. Certainly at-large councilors, the mayor's been out there, but really residents highlighting a problem and then are being able to advocate as a city council with the mayor's administration, but also the city bringing in those state-level legislators, resulted in us being able to get money that's dedicated from the state, additional money flowing into our city budget just for that Jordan Street flooding. And that's an example, I think, of what you're talking about, which is sometimes, how does it work? How do we really advocate with the state to get some of the things that we need?
Yeah. Well, you're raising the important point of how do you even know there's a problem until some neighborhood says enough is enough. And I think the other thing we could point out is that you, Senator Lovely, Representative Paracella, and the mayor all appear at the senior center once a month,
Yes.
or in some cases twice a month, and just to sit and listen, which I think is a tremendous advantage for the taxpayers and the citizens. Say, I got a problem, who do I talk to?
Yes.
Well, you go to the senior center and talk to the one who's going to fix it.
Yeah, and that's been one of my favorite things to do, is those monthly community office hours. And you're right, many of us do them. The senior center, to me, has been a great location to be because it's open to anybody in the community. It doesn't have to just be seniors, but it is a really great sort of hub of activity for seniors who may or may not be easily getting out during the week to other places. And so it's a great touch point for lots of residents. And I've loved getting to meet people that I didn't know there, and I really have gotten to learn a lot about what's happening in people's lives and think about how we might creatively work together to fix some of those problems too.
Well, the other big issue that's going to come up probably on the election and is the city charter.
Yes.
And as I read it, some things they're just going to be fixed because they're just pencil and paper kind of fixes.
Yep.
Some of the things are going to have to appear before the city council to approve, and some of the things are going to have to get on the ballot. When is this division of fixes going to be discussed or published or promulgated?
So the charter has sort of been through a long revision or suggested revision process.
Yeah.
And I know you know that for folks who are listening, it might be hard to even have followed the whole process because it actually started right around the time that the pandemic. Yep. So it's been a long process. 2020. Yes, because you're right. Because technically our charter is revisited every year, ending in a 0. And so of course 2020 was that year. Yeah. Yep. And so this has been a little longer charter process. So there was a charter review committee that was doing its work 2020 and beyond, made some of those recommendations that you're talking about that then came to the city council. We had a chance to discuss them. The charter review committee had a public hearing, and the council did as well. But then the changes kind of spent a little while going back and forth from the city council to the mayor, because the next step really, even before the election, is that things that are potentially changed in a city or town's charter go to the legislature as a home rule petition. And so before you do that as a city, you need to come around to some level of consensus between your executive branch and your legislative group. And so that's why you saw some of the conversation back and forth where the city council would sort of determine which of the changes recommended by the charter review committee we were going to endorse, and then we would get some suggested changes back from the mayor again and have to revisit those. But right now, we're at a point where the charter, including some of the changes that you talked about, and the big ones that would be on the ballot, have to do with structural change. For example, voters will have the chance to determine if they believe that the mayor's term in Beverly should continue as a 2-year term, or should we have a 4-year mayoral term. And that's, not specifically tied to who the mayor is right now.
Yeah.
It's structurally. There's also a question about adding, as you said, adding 2 positions to our school committee that would be sort of at-large positions, or district, as they're called in the proposed change. So those changes are also all going, the whole package is going now to our legislature as a home rule petition.
So it's already on its way.
It's on its way.
Okay.
But those significant changes, really, it's important to let the legislature know we understand that these would be ballot questions. We're not just trying to impose them. So if the legislature approves all of our changes, those will come back. Voters can expect to see them on the next election.
And speaking of the next election, you're going to run it, aren't you?
I am planning to, yes.
Your turn to say your piece.
All right. Thank you, George. So as George said, it's almost time to be thinking about the next election, because candidates, anybody who's interested in running for office in Beverly, and that could be any of you who are watching right now, can start pulling papers to run starting on Monday, the 3rd of April at the city clerk's office. And I will be among those candidates who are going and pulling papers intending to run for another term as a at-large city councilor. I have truly enjoyed my work as an at-large councilor so far. This has been my first term as president of the council, and it has been an incredible honor to serve both my fellow council members and our residents in that way, and to have the chance to really have learned a lot. George and I had the chance to talk about some of the big topics that have come up during this term, and it's been really a privilege to help walk alongside residents through those and to think with my fellow councilors about how we might creatively problem solve together. So I'm excited and hopeful to earn another term and to earn the voters' trust again to continue to be part of the creative work happening in and around our city.
Thank you. And,
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. And if you've got any questions or comments, at the end of the credits is my email address. Send them on. And if you have some comments you want to make, we can make room for you at the table. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.